World War I breaks out, and millions of soldiers fight across Europe. 20 years later, World War II sets the continent on fire. Decades pass, bringing the Cold War and new geopolitical fractures. Through every single one of these overlapping crises, one country sitting right in the middle of the map remained entirely untouched. The threat of war is not a relic of history. Today, military forces still dig trenches next to shattered infrastructure and destroyed bridges. Global conflict is an active, ongoing reality. Yet somehow, while the rest of Europe has been dragged into devastating violence time and time again, Switzerland has managed to stay out of every major international war for more than 2 centuries. The common assumption is that Switzerland sits quietly in the Alps as a pacifist utopia. People tend to think of it as a harmless nation with no real military, relying entirely on the goodwill and restraint of its neighbors to survive. That assumption is completely wrong. Switzerland's long-lasting peace does not come from being harmless. It was forged through a history of extreme bloodshed and maintained by one of the most terrifying defense strategies on Earth. Before it was a symbol of peace, Switzerland was a nation of feared combatants. During the Middle Ages, Swiss infantry units were highly aggressive. Their disciplined, lethal pike formations made them the most sought-after mercenaries by foreign kings looking to conquer new territory. You can still see a surviving ceremonial form of this mercenary legacy today. The Pope's personal bodyguards in Vatican City are the Swiss Guard, a tradition that began in 1506 purely because Swiss soldiers had a reputation as elite, loyal killers. The shift toward peace started with a specific disaster, the Battle of Marignano in 1515, when the Swiss army marched into present-day Milan to fight the French. The Swiss charged the enemy lines with their famous discipline, but they were met by overwhelming French artillery and cavalry. The battle raged for 2 days. Thousands of Swiss soldiers were slaughtered in the mud, marking one of the worst defeats in their history. The scale of the carnage broke the nation's appetite for expansion. Swiss leaders realized fighting foreign wars was becoming too expensive in both money and human lives. They stopped trying to conquer new land and shifted entirely to protecting the borders they already had. 300 years later, the rest of Europe reached a similar exhaustion point. In 1815, the Napoleonic Wars ended, leaving behind a battered continent desperate for stability. European leaders gathered at the Congress of Vienna. Their primary goal was to prevent another massive continental war by creating physical distance between massive rival empires. Look at this map of Europe in 1815. You have large powers like France and Austria pushing directly against each other. Switzerland sits directly in the center, occupying a highly strategic wedge of land. To create a buffer, the major powers agreed to recognize Switzerland's permanent neutrality. In exchange for a guarantee that other countries would respect its independence, Switzerland promised never to join foreign wars or military alliances. It became a neutral wall separating potential enemies. But the Swiss government understood that treaties are just ink on paper. A diplomatic signature cannot stop an invading army. They needed a physical deterrent. Fortunately for Switzerland, nature had already built them a fortress. Almost 60% of the country is covered by the Alps. These harsh, steep mountains and narrow valleys create an absolute logistical nightmare for any invading force trying to move troops, artillery, or supplies. When World War I broke out in 1914, Switzerland immediately mobilized its army to the borders. The combination of armed troops and impassable terrain made an invasion so unappealing that the surrounding nations kept the fighting outside Swiss territory. The mountains kept them safe from the trenches. But 20 years later, a much deadlier enemy would force the Swiss to augment their natural geography with massive human engineering. By 1940, the stakes were entirely different. Switzerland was completely surrounded by territories controlled by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. A German invasion seemed inevitable. General Henri Guisan took command of the Swiss armed forces and prepared the country for the worst-case scenario. He implemented the National Redoubt strategy. If the lowland cities fell, the army would not surrender. Instead, they would abandon the plains and retreat deep into the high alpine mountains to fight a prolonged war of attrition. To ensure an invading army gained nothing of value, the Swiss rigged their own infrastructure. They wired thousands of vital bridges, roads, and rail tunnels with explosives, ready to detonate them instantly to paralyze enemy movement. They also hollowed out the mountains. The military built massive fortresses and artillery positions directly into the alpine rock, often disguising heavy concrete bunkers to look like natural boulders or innocent chalets. Waiting inside those mountains was a fully mobilized citizenry, equipped and trained to wage a brutal, freezing guerrilla war against any occupying force. Hitler weighed the options and ultimately decided not to invade. The massive casualty rate and the destruction of the transport routes simply were not worth the effort. While historians still debate the moral compromises Switzerland made regarding wartime finances and refugees to survive, their military deterrence succeeded. They proved that strict neutrality requires making yourself too costly to kill. That deep-seated paranoia from the World War eras remains built into the country today. During the Cold War, the government mandated that civilian buildings include access to bunkers. Today, Switzerland has thousands of these heavy steel underground shelters, enough to house almost its entire population in the event of an attack. They also maintain a highly trained military. Switzerland is not a demilitarized zone. Military service is compulsory for many young men, keeping a massive reserve force constantly at the ready. Even in peacetime, citizens complete their training, take their military equipment home, and stay integrated in the reserve system. If a threat appears, the country can mobilize a massive, heavily armed force in a matter of days. It creates an interesting paradox. Switzerland refuses to join NATO or enter foreign military alliances. Yet, because they are fiercely independent and heavily armed, they are trusted by almost every nation on Earth. Global actors know that Swiss territory is secure. This makes it the perfect base for organizations that require strict impartiality to function, like the International Committee of the Red Cross. It's why Geneva hosts major United Nations offices and constantly serves as the neutral ground for high-stakes international peace negotiations. True peace doesn't come from simply refusing to fight. For Switzerland, neutrality requires a delicate balance of diplomacy, a punishing geographic advantage, and a defense infrastructure so intimidating that no one ever wants to test it. Looking at the rest of the world, do you think any other country could pull this off?